Morning, everybody. Today we're going to move on into the respiratory system. Basically, when we look at the respiratory system, it's going to work in conjunction with the cardiovascular system in doing something that is of major importance in the body, and that is to deliver oxygen to all the cells of the body and to take up the waste product, which is carbon dioxide. And this is not going to be accomplished unless we have both of those systems functioning properly in order to get that done. So the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system are going to share those responsibilities. And the first part of what I want to talk about today in the respiratory system is basically that passageway that takes that air down to the area where the exchange of gases are going to occur. And then from there, basically, we're going to be talking about the physiology, or how does that gas exchange occur in that area. One of the things that we talked about earlier was the different kinds of membranes that are going to be involved in the body. And one of the kinds of membranes we talked about was the mucous membranes. And mucous membranes are those membranes that line the areas in the body that have an opening to the outside. The respiratory system has mucous membrane lining the entire surface. Once we get inside the areas that do not have openings to the outside of the body, we have serosal membranes. We have a parietal membrane, which is going to be the kind that covers the surface of the cavity, the thorax, or the chest cavity. And then we're going to have a type that's going to adhere to the organ itself, the viscera, the lung, and that would be the visceral serosa. So what it's called in the case of the respiratory system is called pleura. So we have pleural visceral pleura, and we have parietal pleura. Visceral pleura will be the type of serosa that covers the organ itself, the lung, the outside covering, and then parietal would be the type of serosal membrane that covers the cavity or the thorax. And those two membranes are going to have a fluid between them, a serosal fluid that will basically make them stick together. So as the chest cavity moves, so moves the lungs, which is how we create the vacuum in there, and how we get mechanical breathing accomplished. Okay, so when we start looking at basically the passageway in the respiratory system, and you should be able to go through each of the structures, even in minute anatomy, in tracing air as it goes into the body and then gets eventually into the exchange zone, into the microscopic parts of the lung. So we have the nose, air going in, and we also always talk about air coming in through the nose because that's where it is what was meant to come into the body, and not so much through the mouth, except in excessive breathing, like in exercise. Basically, we should be breathing through our nose unless we have, cold or something where the mucous membrane gets swollen and blocks. The mucus blocks the airway in the nasal cavity, and so we have to breathe some of that through our mouth. But basically, we start with the nose. So it goes from the nose to the pharynx, to the larynx, to the trachea, to the bronchi, and then eventually into the exchange zones, which are the alveoli. When we look at a section of this in the body, we see that the air is going to basically come through the nose. Okay, the nose is basically going to be, for the most part, about 80% of elastic cartilage holding it open so that air can freely move through there. We're also going to have some areas along the lateral portions of the nasal cavity that are going to kind of cause turbulence of the air, and we do that for a reason, and that is that it allows us to take more impurities out of the air as it moves through the nasal cavity. So it goes in through the external openings of the body of the nose, which are called the external nares, and it goes into the nasal cavity and then moves down into the pharynx. So the gas exchange between the blood and the external environment is our ultimate goal, and that's going to occur in the very tiny microscopic air sacs in the lungs. The passageways to the lungs are long and very branched, and increases the amount of surface area that the air encounters on its way down into the alveoli. And there's a good reason for that, and that's because we want to filter out the air as much as possible, take as many impurities out. So as the air goes from the nose all the way down into the alveoli, that passageway is going to warm the air as it's coming in to allow it to diffuse better. It's going to add moisture to it, which will allow it to diffuse. Obviously, these gas molecules aren't going to be able to diffuse unless they're dissolved in water. And we're going to purify the air by having foreign materials get stuck into the continuously produced mucus along the mucous membrane that coats our passageway all the way down to the lungs. So warm, moistening, and purifying and filtering the air as it goes down. So the only thing that you're actually going to see externally of the respiratory system is going to be the nose. And like I said, most of that is going to be cartilage that is with skin covered over it. The nose itself is going to be held open by elastic cartilage. And then the most superior portion of the nose is going to be a bridge of bone at the top. So we also have two openings, the external nares. As they go into the nasal cavity, there's going to be a dividing septum in the nasal cavity, which will have the air go right and left. As you can see, as air comes in, it's going to be there's going to be some areas of turbulence created by the nasal concha, and that's a good thing because that increases surface area, and it also slows the air down so that it has more chance to have trapped particles get into the mucosa or the mucus lining the nasal cavity. So also in the nose area, we always think of being able to smell in our nose. Well, we smell through the nasal cavity olfactory receptors, which are going to be located in the superior surface of that nasal cavity. And they're going to be located within that mucous membrane. So that's where we'll initially pick up the sensation of smell and take those impulses directly to the olfactory nerve, which leads directly into the brain, one of those cranial nerves. The rest of the cavity is going to be lined with respiratory mucosa, as we said. That is going to add moisture to the air, and it's also going to trap those incoming foreign particles so that we can get rid of those. By the time air gets down all the way down into the alveolar sacs, it's going to be filtered out many, many times to where the air is pretty well cleared of most impurities. And like I said, the lateral walls are going to have projections in them called concha, and that's going to increase the surface area and increase turbulence, which will kind of slow the air down and allow it to be filtered by the mucosa. We're going to have a separation point between the nasal cavity and inferiorly the oral cavity, and that'll be by the palate. Okay, we have a soft palate and a hard palate. The hard palate obviously is that part that has bone separating it, and the posterior part would be the part that is not supported by bone. It's supported by muscle and soft tissue. Okay. whenever this palate does not form, whenever the bones do not meet medially, we call that a cleft palate, and that creates problem with the material being chewed properly and all those things that go on in the oral cavity, as well as the air passageway in the superior portion. So that cleft palate has to be sealed off in order for those functions to occur properly. So that cleft palate has to be fixed. We also have, surrounding the nasal cavity, we have sinuses, which we've already talked about when we talked about the skeletal system. We have sinuses located on all the bones that surround the nasal cavity, which would be the frontal bone, the sphenoid, the ethmoid, and the maxillary bone. And they're all going to be areas where there's a hollow portion to the bone, and that will lighten up the bone, lighten up the skull, and it also provides for a resonance to the voice. Okay. So you can see some of the sinuses right here in the frontal bone, here in the sphenoid, and so forth. So all the bones that surround the nasal cavity are going to have sinuses in them that will lighten up the bones. And like I said, they're going to act as a resonance chamber, which makes your speech sound a little bit more distinct. And they're all lined with mucous membrane, and those mucous membranes will all drain into the nasal cavity, as well as that little tube that comes from your ears. It will also drain down into your nasal cavity. So all those areas are going to be connected to your nasal cavity. And one of the reasons why, if you get an infection, a mucosal infection like a cold, sometimes it ends up infecting your ears, or the tubes that lead to your ears, because they are connected. And also you end up with sinusitis, which is an inflammation of your sinus membranes, because they're connected to the nasal mucosa also. So they're all connected, and they can all get infected at the same time. From the nasal cavity, air is going to be directed posteriorly into an area called the pharynx, which commonly is called the throat area. Okay, there are three regions: the top, the middle, and the bottom part. The superior region is called the nasopharynx because it is the part of the throat that is connected to the nasal cavity. There's an oral pharynx, which is the middle portion, which is connected to the oral cavity. And then there's a laryngopharynx, which is the inferior portion, and that's the part that leads into the larynx. So the oral pharynx and the laryngopharynx are common passageways for air and food, and we have to have a synchronized reflex for when we swallow, so to make sure that the food goes into the food tube and that the air stays clear in the airway. We also have some lymphatic tissue that is in this area. We have tonsils that are from superior to inferior, are the pharyngeal tonsil, which are also called the adenoids, located in the nasopharynx. The palatine tonsils are located in the oral pharynx, and the lingual tonsils are going to be located at the base of the tongue, down in the most inferior portion of the pharynx. So all three of those are going to be parts of our lymphatic system to help produce white blood cells that fight disease. When I was a child, they were of the opinion that these were just more trouble than they were worth, and they regularly took these out whenever a person got numerous sore throats. Now that we have antibiotics that take care of that, we don't take the tonsils out as much, and we do recognize that they do have a function in helping to prevent disease. So you can see the tonsils here, here, and here, the base of the tongue. And these are the ones that you see the most right here, the palatine tonsil. Whenever you have an infection or sore throat, usually you see this one enlarged in the back of your throat. That's the only one you can usually see. And maybe this one down here also, but the adenoids you don't see. So air comes in through your nasal cavity, goes down through the nasopharynx, through the oropharynx, and then eventually down into the laryngopharynx. And this route leads us into a juncture where we have to make a decision whether air is going to go stay in the front tube or the anterior tube, or whether it's food and water that will go into the tube in the back of the airway, which is our esophagus. Now, when it goes through the larynx, it's going to go through an area where there is 8 rigid hyaline cartilages lined up in a spoon-shaped flap of elastic cartilage, which is called the epiglottis. The glottis is a Latin term that means opening. Epi, of course, means above. And this epiglottis is going to flap shut over the airway whenever we're swallowing, so the food slides over the spoon-shaped cartilage and allows the food to go into the esophagus and stay out of the airway. Now, if any food does get into the airway, we have a reflex that causes us to cough until we clear that obstruction in the airway. The largest of those cartilages in the front of the airway is called the thyroid cartilage, which is in males protrudes even more anteriorly, and we call that the Adam's apple. Just because of hormonal differences, that it protrudes just a little bit more in males than females. That's why it's called Adam's apple. The epiglottis, like I said, protects the superior opening to the larynx, and it routes food into the esophagus, keeps the airway open. And when you're swallowing, there's a reflex that occurs that makes the epiglottis rise and form a lid over that opening to the larynx. One of the other things that's located in the larynx area is folds of connective tissue, which are going to be called the vocal cords, and they vibrate as air is pushed across them. And when they vibrate, they make either a high-pitched or a low-pitched sound, depending upon whether those cords are stretched out or whether they are allowed to be loose. And that will be just like the strings on a guitar being plucked. They'll either vibrate many vibrations per second or very low vibrations per second, depending upon whether the vocal cords are loose or whether they're stiff. And like I said before, the glottis is the opening that leads into the airway. Glottis is a Latin term that means basically opening. So down here, we can see anteriorly we're going to have the airway. Posteriorly, we're going to have the esophagus, the food tube, where air and food and water go. So when we take food into the mouth, we swallow, push it down into this area right here, and eventually this epiglottis right here, this little flap of cartilage, will come down. It'll push up the larynx, which pushes down the flap, and the food and the water will rush over the top of that and stay into the esophagus and protect the airway here. You can also see the opening. The glottis has these 2 folds, which are called the vocal cords, which can create sound. Now, beyond the larynx, go back here to that picture. Beyond there, we're going to have an area that is called the trachea, about a 4 or 5 inch long tube that is held open by cartilage rings. And these cartilage rings are going to be in a C shape, and there's a very, very important reason why it's in a C shape. The open part of the C will be facing posteriorly into the esophagus. Also, these tubes are going to be lined with ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue, which we talked about, that are going to help to, these cilia beat in unison, and they'll help to move the mucus up and out of the airway and into the throat area where they're going to be swallowed, and all the impurities that are picked up in the mucus are going to be run through the digestive tract, and they'll all be digested and broken down. So just part of our cleansing system. You can see when you look at it from a superior view, the esophagus is going to be here, and then these C-shaped cartilages will keep the trachea open. The lumen of the trachea, you can see the opening is right here, and whenever we swallow food, the lumen of the esophagus gets stretched out, it gets larger, so it has place to expand into the lumen of the trachea. Now that's not a problem, because while we're swallowing, we're not breathing, basically. So if this esophagus stretches into that C-shaped opening, there's not a problem, because there's no breathing going on at the same time. At least there shouldn't be. And here you can see a picture of the ciliated pseudostratified columnar that is lining the trachea, that helps to move that mucus up and out of the airway. Now, as we get down to the bottom of the trachea, we're going to be branching into two large cartilage, O-shaped rings of cartilage tubes, and these are basically our primary bronchi. And they're the two major divisions off the trachea. They'll enter the lung in a depressed area called the hilum, and one will go right, one will go left. The one that goes to the right, as we were looking at the lungs, when we looked at the heart, you can see that the heart is tilted to the left, so the left lung is going to be a little bit smaller than the one on the right. It's going to have only 2 lobes because of the displacement from the heart. The lung on the right is going to have 3 lobes. It's going to be a little bit bigger. The lung on the right is going to have a little bit straighter shot from the primary bronchi that branches off the trachea. So if we get any obstruction that gets into the airway, it typically will go into the right lung, because the bronchus that leads into that is more of a straight shot than the one to the left. These bronchi are going to then very quickly start dividing and make up the respiratory tree, as we call it, into smaller and smaller branches that are still cartilage with O-ring cartilages that hold it open. So you can see the 2 major bronchi leading into the lung tissue there. Very quickly, these bronchi are going to branch, and as you can see, they still have cartilage rings on them. They'll branch and branch and branch into primary, secondary, and tertiary branches off of the main bronchus, and these are going to be called bronchioles, and they'll eventually lead into the soft tissue where the exchanges occur. So basically, the lungs are only going to be about 2.5 pounds. There's not a whole lot of tissue there, because the majority of the lung is basically open space or air. The space occupied by that air is going to take up most of the thorax. The other part of that is going to be taken up by the heart and the mediastinum, which is the middle portion of the thorax. Now, just like we talked about the apex and the base of the heart, the apex and the heart and the base of the lung is going to be kind of flip-flopped. The base is going to rest, the base of each lung is going to rest on the diaphragm, and it will kind of stick to the diaphragm because of the serosal membranes having that fluid between them, and it'll cause them to stick together like 2 pieces of wax paper with water between them. And the apex of each lung is going to be at the top, just underneath each clavicle. So each lung is then going to be moving as the chest cavity moves. And like I said, the left lung is going to have 2 lobes, the right lung is going to have 3 lobes because of a little bit of the difference in size and the tilt of the heart. As you can see, on the right side over here we have the 3 lobes of the lung, and over here the left side we have the 2 lobes of the lung, with the heart basically tilting into the left side. Okay, so we've already kind of talked about the serosa covering the outer surface of the lung, And we talked about the type of serosa that covers each of the lungs is called the visceral pleura, and the type of serosa that covers the cavity that they lie in is called the parietal pleura. And those two are going to have a serosal fluid that fills in the area between them and kind of makes them stick together. So as the chest cavity moves with the diaphragm and the rib cage lifting up, you inhale, and then as the diaphragm pushes up and the rib cage closes down, you have an exhalation. We'll talk about those ventilation properties in the next section when we talk about breathing. So as we go through the bronchial tree, basically you have your primary bronchus, the right and the left, and then you have a secondary branch and then a third branch, and eventually get into the smallest of the branches, which are basically just called bronchioles, and then you get into the bronchioles that lead into the respiratory zones where the gas exchange is going to occur. Those are called terminal bronchioles. So you can see the terminal bronchiole here in each one of the sections will lead into respiratory bronchioles, which are going to lead into the alveolar sacs by way of the alveolar duct, and eventually into the individual sacs, which are called alveoli. So once again, it'll go from the terminal bronchiole into the respiratory bronchioles, into the alveolar duct, which will bring it into the alveolar sac, which eventually brings it into the individual air sac, which is the alveoli. So that's your route, your functional anatomy of the passageway. So once again, you have the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, the alveolar sacs, and then the individual alveoli themselves. Now, individually, the alveoli, we're going to have about over 1 million of these alveoli in an average human in each one of the lungs. So the lung is going to be made up of these 1 cell thick little air sacs that have mainly are filled up with gas. Okay, so the majority of the lung is not going to be tissue. The majority of the lung should be gases. You can see the open areas of the lung here with an electron micrograph. When you look at an X-ray of the lungs, they should be dark because most of the lungs should be airspace, which shows up dark on an X-ray. Whenever there's solid tissue or solid material in the lung, it shows up as a light area. That means there's either fluid in the lung or the lungs are swollen or something's going on there to cause a thickness. So when we get right down to the bottom line, is each one of these alveoli is going to be a thin squamous layer thick, and it's that way for a very good purpose, so that the gases can diffuse across from the fluid that's on either side of the wall, and it can get across that wall very easily. There are alveolar pores which connect neighboring air sacs in case there's an obstruction, which allows them another area to get air when one area is clogged up. And then on top of each of those little air sacs, we're going to have a cluster of capillaries. So the lungs are going to be loaded with blood because they're mainly capillary beds, which cover the external surfaces of each of the air sacs. So on one side of the membrane it's going to be air, and the other side is going to be blood flowing past, and there's going to be a 1 cell thickness between them. So the air is going to be exchanged through that 1 cell thickness. What we also have is these little macrophages, not little, very large macrophages that kind of work like in an amoeboid motion. And they kind of slither in and out of the air sac and into the bloodstream, and they just kind of roam around looking for foreign invaders, and they engulf them and break them down and get rid of them. So any bacteria or anything that's still in that air will be picked up by a macrophage and destroyed. So we have our last line of defense in the airway. We've tried to capture most of the impurities in the mucus that's been produced through the mucous membrane and then moved out through the cilia. And then the very last thing that we have in our line of defense is the macrophages. You can see there's only a 1 cell thickness on each of the alveolar walls, so that carbon dioxide and oxygen can easily pass through diffusion. So oxygen is going to enter the blood from the alveolar space inside, and the carbon dioxide is going to go from the bloodstream. It's going to go into the alveolar space. And like we already said, these macrophages, which are commonly called dust cells, are going to be our patrol cells from our immune system, and they're going to try to pick up any foreign invaders that are in the area. One of the things we haven't talked about is the little cuboidal cells that are intermittently mixed in with these squamous cells in the alveoli. And these cuboidal cells are going to produce a fatty substance that is called surfactant. And it coats the alveolar surfaces. And what it does, it lowers the surface tension of the alveoli, or the film of water that covers the alveoli. We said it has to be a water environment around here in order for diffusion to occur. This water environment is broken down so there's less surface tension, which means whenever you inhale and exhale, these alveolar surfaces won't collapse. They'll stay open. When a child is born, one of the major concerns is whether they have, if they're born premature, is whether they have enough surfactant that's been produced so that they can breathe effectively enough to stay alive. The more premature a baby is, the less surfactant it has, and the greater the chance of the baby not being able to breathe enough because of the lack of surfactant and the fact that the alveoli can collapse whenever they breathe. So that's a major concern. Surfactant is a lipid molecule that breaks down surface tension. It kind of does the same thing that detergent does whenever you're washing dishes. It breaks down surface area. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get into the physiology of the respiratory system, and that'll be our next topic for discussion. So that's all for functional anatomy of the respiratory system. And that's all for today. Adios, amoebas.